Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Essington, and I am a professor of education at Blackburn College in the United States. And I would like to thank the International Academy of Social Sciences for inviting me to speak with you today, especially on the topic of discriminatory effects of international standardized testing, pre- primarily in education, and how these effects kind of translate to other aspects of the world and how it has long-ranging effects for students and also countries as a whole. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. So a little bit about my background. I'm a professor of education. I was also a secondary social studies teacher, and I work on a governing board for a special education co-op in our local area. So that's kind of some of my background as far as education. So there's three parts that I'm going to talk about today. One is why we test. The second is going to be how we test. And then the third is going to be the use of those tests. So how are these standardized tests that compare countries and nations, how they're being used and the effects of this usage of the testing. So first, what I wanted to talk about is why we test. So like, why do we do this? The field of education is built around the concept of individualized growth and working with students so they can reach their potential. However, when we get into these standardized tests, especially when they're these international tests, for example, the PISA test, which generally gets considered to be the best of the worst case scenario that we use when we're testing. It tests better than other standardized tests, but it still has its own flaws. So PISA is kind of like the baseline for this. And the positive of this, and this was coming kind of from the National Academy of Education in the United States, the positive they found in these types of tests is that it helps nations think globally about education instead of just about themselves. But we see that testing is done for ranking. We want to compare and rank countries. All right, we can see who's developing, who's progressing, who's not, who's stalled, and then this leads to this anxiety of where we stand, which then can help promote funding in education for these different countries and helps promote more money being brought into education and taken away from other fields. So it's not necessarily about individual students. It's going to be about comparing and using these comparing to compare countries and students and how well they're performing. How we test is also kind of a limiting effect. We have to limit what types of tests we use because we want comparison across borders, across cultures, across languages. So the testing itself is very limited. And it takes away from a lot of types of intelligences that can't be tested in this standardized way. So we're really limiting what we're looking for. It's like we're testing how well do you do on this one specific type of question in this one type of specific environment, which is very limiting for how we use this, but it doesn't limit how we interpret these results. It's very limited to who gets tested, right? Countries can select who gets tested, so the samples are very marginalized, and a lot of times our measures for success are very Western dominated. So the West seems to be select how we decide who's the winners and who's the losers in these testings. And then it takes us to the use of the test. This is the problematic nature of the testing, is that we see a kind of a cycle that goes on. Those countries that score high, they're seen as more progressive, more developed, which then economically, they get more investment. Their workers will then get paid more. And if you're from a country that scores lower, there's two issues that come to mind. It's that you get capital flight. So the better students and the more higher paying jobs leave those countries. Students tend to try to go to the countries who score higher on these tests. And then we also see that the lower scores also lead to jobs coming into those countries that are the lower paying jobs, the menial tasks. So you're seeing this perpetuation of the countries who have the most money already, then score higher, and then keep those jobs, and then bring in talent from the outside rather than talent staying in these other countries because they've been deemed as secondary because of their test scores. And this is kind of perpetuating that bias that we see. And if you look at the maps, it's usually a bias against the Southern Hemisphere. And a lot of times it promotes the Western Hemisphere. So it's kind of all of this gets perpetuated. So one of the conclusions of this is kind of based on this idea of, do we need to get rid of standardized testing? In the United States and Britain, there's been issues since the summer of 2020 on this idea of making tests optional for college and university acceptance. Maybe this is something that we can move towards as far as international testing, realizing the biases, seeing that it's more of a negative effect than a positive, and hopefully eliminating this perpetual cycle that we've been promoting And my overall message for this is that we're seeing this unequal outcomes based on inequitable foundations, right, which perpetuates worldwide discrimination on varying people who cannot then achieve the standard that is set on this type of testing. So that's kind of my idea, is this idea of tests can measure one specific thing, but then they're being used to kind of limit the abilities of others to succeed. Thank you for your time.